In this video, we're going to take a look at Graf von Faber Castelle Viper Green. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is a nice performing solid green. It's just not one I'm running to use a whole lot. I'm very happy I got to use it in some of the tones that I see, but it's just not that green that I see a real desire for a bottle for myself for. It can shade, just not as much as I would prefer from a green ink, which is why I wouldn't really run for it. Though its tone variation by pen is really good. It does shade well given the right paper and pen combination. Now, I wouldn't expect a lot of shading on more absorbent papers, and it doesn't. And there, some of what it did, it looked a little bit more aggressive than I had actually expected it to be. Much more having to do with the paper than the ink itself. But it's just not that great. Now, I don't have it to put on camera, but a cream color paper is making this ink look much more vibrant than we got in the writing samples that are to come, which are mostly done on white or slightly off-white paper. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Regal Airmail. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread, we get a tiny bit of shading. It's not too bad in what's happening there. I just think I would prefer to see a little bit more in what's going on, but I do think that the tone looks very nice there. It's very crisp and refreshing, is the way that I tend to see this. Now, the broad is much darker than the fine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has much better shading. I think it looks very nice here in what's going on in its entirety and how it's behaving. I just really see the shading standing out the best here with that round nib. Now, the stub nib is a little bit lighter than what we see in the broad, certainly a little darker than the medium. It has no feather, it has no spread, it shades a little bit less than the broad does. It's the line variation with this ink that really makes it appear like it's shading a whole lot more. It's doing truly a fantastic job. It looks great. I just don't know how many people are running to the stub nib to be able to take some notes on a normal day. But I do think that this looks really good. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Lamy All-Star with a fine nib. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib. A Lamy Safari with a 1.1 stub. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread. It's certainly a much lighter tone than we saw on the Clairfontaine. There's one or two moments of shading that happen. It's not crisp here. It's very kind of light and airy, very easy to read, not light that you can't read it. But it is certainly refreshing, I guess, as a tone. It's got a very clean look to it. Now, the broad is much darker than the fine. It has tiny feathers that do occur, only the tiniest feathers, and only a little bit. It's really not the end of the world of what's going on, but you do see it, especially as you move down and you see the word furthermore on the fourth line of writing. It is a broader, wetter pen on paper that's more absorbent. Looking at the stub nib, it is a little bit lighter than the broad. It's certainly a little darker than the fine. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It is showing some shading and some very nice personality coming through here. This, I really don't see somebody wanting to use a stub on a reporter notebook, but if you wanted to make those notes especially pretty, you certainly could. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get a fair amount of feathering that's going on, and it's fairly consistent. There's a lot of it. I do think that it's performing very well on this paper, considering it's not really made for fountain pens. So I'm not going to hold that here as the biggest deal. It's a pretty light tone, but still easy to read. The broad nib is much darker than the fine. It's also a little bit wetter in its writing. It has feathering, fairly consistent over all of it. It's not something that I would really want to use, not something that I would expect that I use a ton on this pad, but I do write with broad nibs. It spreads a little bit, but the tiniest bit. Again, that feathering is really the one that's distracting it. Not a lot of shading going on. It's the paper that's making all of that go away. The stub nib really loses a lot of its effect here. Now, you do get the normal line variation that is that stub, but there is some spread occurring that is kind of eating it up a little bit. Also with the feathering, that is substantial. Let's say it that way. This is not very nice in how it looks. Not really much for shading. Only one or two darker spots have occurred. Looking at the back of the page, there's actually quite a bit of show-through that's going on, but I do not think this would stop you from using the back of the page. None of this bled through and touched the page underneath. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it's writing a little bit darker than we got on the FieldNotes. We're not really getting the feather. We do have a tiny bit of spread. It's really not something that itself is a problem. I said no real feather. There is tiny bits. It should be cheaper paper, but this is performing, I think, better than the FieldNotes did. You see a little bit of shade that does occur in the word that at the H that's a little bit darker. That's also where you see that little bit of feathering that's going on. The broad nib is quite a bit darker than the fine. It has tiny feathering, but I think it's manageable. It's not really spreading. It is giving a little bit of shading, which was quite surprising. Now, the shading tends to occur a little bit more at the bottom of words, so at the bottom of your stroke of a letter, not so much at the top of the stroke. So where you're lifting the pen up and putting a little less ink down, you get a little less of that shading. The darker areas look very nice here, though. The stub nib is right about the same tone as the broad. It's got only minor feathering. It's not something that would stop me from using it on this pad. This has become a pad that I actually like using a whole lot because of its performance with fountain pens. It's got no real spread, so you do get the benefit of that stub nib. We are getting the tiniest bits of shading, just a very light peppering of shading, not too much. Nothing really that you would think matters. Looking at the back of the page, we get only minor ghosting, and that's because of the darker color, but we get no bleed through. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company's Shenley Park Thicket Green. Here is Cross Green. Here is Diamine Sherwood Green. Here is KWZ Rotten Green. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get quite a bit of feathering, very tiny feathering the entire way through. We also get a fair amount of consistent spread. This fine really worked its way up to a medium broad in its size, which contributed to some of the issues that this particular paper is going to have with this ink. We get no shading. The tone is about what we've seen on the Portage paper, so not too bad. The broad nib has feathering, has spread, has no shade, really doesn't look good. That's the very simple of it. It doesn't look good. It is a little bit darker than what we had with the fine. The stub nib is a tiny bit lighter than we got with the broad. It is a little bit darker than we got with the fine. It has feathering, it has spread, it looks gross, it has no shading. This paper really isn't meant for this type of usage, so it having a little bit of problem with broader, wetter pens isn't something that I would make a huge deal out of. Looking at the next page, we see a lot of spots where it did touch the page underneath, and that's because of the massive amount of bleed and ghost that this paper has given. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is Diatramentis Velvet Black Gold. Here is Geherban Terre de Fouille. Here is Krishna Orange. Here is Papier Plume Violet. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, there is feather. It's tiny, it's manageable. I don't see this being the biggest deal here. There is some spread. That fine comes up to about a fine medium. It's a little thicker. It's not the end of the world given this paper. It's got no shading. It's just there. It's performing very well, legitimately, in what's going on. The broad nib has the same tiny bit of feathering all over it. It does have a little bit of spread. There's a couple of moments where things are a little bit darker, which made me feel like it may bleed through, but there is a couple moments that are darker in for some shading. The stub nib is about the same tone as the broad. It has feather. It has spread. These are things we expect with this paper. It does not have any kind of shading. Looking at the back of the page, we see that there was a lot of show through, a lot of bleed into the paper, but not through the paper. It did not touch the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? In choosing the pen, I'm really using Clairfontaine to get a real idea here. I liked the shading and much more frequent darker tones that I got from a medium flow broad pen. Now, the tone from the dry pen is very crisp and nice looking on the page. It just lacks some of the shading that I would very much prefer in my green. Regardless of that, though, its performance in any of the nibs on better paper, it's a great color. Just for me, I want a wet broad and to really see that shading come out. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.